Hello everyone. In this video we are going to talk about creation of service object. For things to complete, I'll even deploy a deployment object which would have a connection with service object. So what is the service object? It is a way to expose an application running on a set of pods to public, or we can say internet, or other internal resources. For example, we have an Nginx pod running, but how do you access that web portal? Should I go and check in the browser with local IP? So what should I exactly do? That's when the service object comes into play. So how do we access it? We'll see that shortly. There are two different service objects which I would like to talk about here. One is cluster IP and another one is node port. Let's check the differences in a visual. So let me just open up a quick notepad. MS Paint. So if you see here, bear with me, this is the picture what I can possibly come up with. When resources that needs to find other resources running in the same cluster, then we're supposed to use cluster IP. For example, the pods in the left, we can say that as a database, maybe. Yeah, we can call that as a database, service running in these pods. And the pods on the right are application, we can say web application, or Nginx, we can say web application running in it. If the web application need to access the database, that's where we require the cluster IP service object. All right. So even without the cluster IP, the service object, even without the cluster IP, right, the pod can directly, can be pointed to the database service object directly. But what if the database pod goes down? What if this one goes down? The web application pod would not be able to connect to database pod, and the application completely cannot be accessed by customers or vendors. So service object here acts as a centralized hub that points to the appropriate pods. So the next service object is node port. Here is the visual. When you want to expose the application to public, then we should use node port service object. As simple as that. See, assume that Nginx web application is running in the pods at the right, right? And if you want to expose it to the internet, you must create a node port service object. This is what we are going to see in the lab. So let's create a Nginx deployment, and then we'll create a node port service object. All right. First, I'll create it in a declarative way. At last, I'll show you how it can be created with imperative commands. I'll use the same deployment YAML file from the previous video to deploy the Nginx application. Let me quickly copy paste that. So here it's all about creating a new deployment file which would deploy the Nginx application here. So you probably know what these things are from the previous video. So I'm going to just apply this. So before that, let me just see what other services that are running in the default namespace. There's none. It's just the default service objects for Kubernetes cluster itself. So pods, any pods? Okay, sorry, it's kubectl get all will show you all the information. So none of the services that are running right now. So right now I'm gonna apply this 05 deployment. So once this has been deployed, let's just say get all, which would show us one deployment has been spun up, which eventually created a replica set. And based on the replicas that I've mentioned here, it says it has created two pods here. So let me just put get all again, and the two of the pods are running now. So let's create a service objects in this the same folder here. So I'll create a new file for this. You can create it in the same file, but I'm gonna create it in the new file, services.yaml. So as usual, we'll start with the API version, v1, and the kind is service, and metadata space name equal to my service, I'm gonna say, and then spec. So type, it's a node port. I'm going to create a node port service here. All right. And the ports. So here, the ports, what I'm mentioning under the ports, we have a bunch of attributes. The target port is nothing but the port in the pod, okay, where the Nginx application is running. So the Nginx by default, it's 80, right? So that's what I mentioned it as 80. So now the port, there is another attribute called port, which is a service object port, the port in the service object. Usually in any deployment, the service object port would be used the same as the target port. So that's what we are going to follow even here. So the node port, it's let's say, like, I'm going to expose it to 30038. So node port is nothing but the port through which the application can be accessed from the external network, from the public internet. All right. So that's the port that we need to mention here. So once that is done, you'll have to mention the selector, as I was saying. Selector, it's the selector is nothing but the label, one of the labels of pods, right? So if you see here the deployment, so we are mentioning the deployment of all the pods must have the labels app, my app, right? So that's exactly what we are mentioning here, so that the service object would point all the traffic to the pods which has this particular label. Okay, so that's exactly what I mentioned here. So let's quickly spin up the service object here, which is service object. So once okay, there's something wrong here. Okay, I misspelled it. Spec here is SPEC. So let me rerun that again. All right, so now the service has been created. So you just type git kubectl get all, and that will show you the service. And if you wanted to specifically look for the service, it's all about just git kubectl, kubectl describe, then that particular service here. So that's what give you more information about that service itself. Excuse me. Describe kubectl, yeah. So this would give you more information about that service. So what are the selectors being used, and etc., and the port and the target port, all that. So now that has been exposed right now, let's try to access it from the browser in my laptop with the IP localhost. It is running in the localhost 30038 is the port that we are exposing it, right? There you go. So the Nginx is now is being published to the internet, I would say. If I have a public IP address in my home internet service provider, if I have bought it, then this would have been accessed through the public IP. So now since I don't have a dedicated public IP, I'm accessing with a local IP with that specific port here. So yeah, that's it's all about the service object and how we can deploy it. And we'll see more about the imperative command, how easily we can do this without even writing a YAML file, just by running just 2 commands for deploying and creating a service object in an imperative command in the next video. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great day.